time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Thanks to John Schaefer for that outstanding introduction that he does so often on the show. We recorded that a while back. John's he's a content creator out of Des Moines, Iowa. You can Google him and find him. John Schaefer, the son of the great Maxwell Schaefer, the radio personality, the great voice of the Midwest, the music man from Iowa. But anyway, we've, I got to try to get my spirits up here. I want to get my energy going, as they say, because it's been hard, folks. This Uvalde thing is what we're going to be talking about today. And my God, it is so tragic and heartbreaking. Some of what we're going to see and hear on the show today, some people are shying away from, but I'm trying to get people to pay attention. Look at this. I mean, this is what we're going to be talking about today. If you look, if it bothers you as much as it does me, maybe we will do something today. And our guest is going to tell us what we could and what we should do about all of this. And our guest coming on the podcast by George Live Line is Joe Gorton. Joe is an academic. He's a professor from college that has now made his life's work, really, Brady United. And it's an organization that's combating gun violence. It's based around the name of Jim Brady. And let's just bring him in here and get him to tell us a little bit more about Brady United. So good morning, Joe, and welcome to the Live Line.
Thank you, George. Good morning to you.
Yeah, Jim Brady. Okay, here's what I know about to kind of lay the groundwork, the very basics, the fundamentals of this. Brady was an aide to Reagan. They were both shot and survived, I think, outside of Washington, D.C., in a hotel, outside a hotel in Washington, D.C. And then, like so many people, and I don't blame the guy, I don't want to speak critically of him, but he kind of had a come to Jesus moment when it comes to guns. And he was the primary proponent for the rest of his life of a ban, of a restriction on assault weapons. And then with his passing after he left, it all kind of went by the wayside, and a lot of his work now, I don't know, needs to be redone. Maybe. Have I got that right?
Well, I'd say some of the particulars are correct. I mean, Mr. Brady was President Reagan's press secretary, and he was killed, and others, including the president, were shot by a maniac who had no trouble getting his hands on a handgun. And that was really it was really a great moment for those of us who are interested in reducing gun violence, because it ushered in some bipartisanship. Obviously, the Reagan team were Republicans, and the gun violence movement had been largely Democrats. But this created a moment where gun violence organizations, particularly what became Brady United, developed a more bipartisan approach, reaching out across the political ideologies to try to reduce gun violence.
All right, great. I want to jump into the Uvalde situation. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about, folks, today. None of it's very good. Maybe some of the ideas of how to address this are good. But I wanted to start off by, we're going to show some slides here like I always do, and some videos and maybe something from the web. But I want to bring this up. This is first and foremost. This is what I want people to think about. This is what I want people to look at as Joe and I are talking today. I mean, we're a couple of old gummers here, but my God, look at the beauty. Look at these children. And this is from the National Gun Violence Memorial. And I hope to scroll through this towards the end of the show with Joe to show a lot of what's on there. This is just 4 slides, 4 photos, folks. These victims down in Uvalde. This will break your heart. And it's tough for Joe because he has to deal with this all the time and look at this. But I want people to look at this. And there's Irma Garcia. This is one of the teachers. We don't, we see the kids, but this is one of the teachers down in Uvalde. You got to remember, this is a 4th grade classroom. When you're in 4th grade, I remember my 4th grade teacher. God, we loved her. I mean, I just look at that and I think of my own 4th grade experience. And this Irma Garcia, one of the 2 teachers that were gunned down in Uvalde, and then Jackie Cazares. Again, it's hard to look at these things, but Jackie her father has been quoted. He was one of the people outside of the building in Uvalde that wanted the police to go in, and he's been quoted. And I talked about him on the show yesterday. So, okay, I wanted to start off with that because to me that's the most important part of this. Obviously, it's the victims, it's the kids. But here's some of the reporting from today that I wanted to bring up for people to look at. And this is out of Newsweek. Cowards. Uvalde cops face America's wrath over a bungled shooting response. Now let's get this up large enough to where I can read it. Police are facing heavy criticism and being labeled cowards for their reaction to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas this week. A total of 19 children, 2 adults, and the alleged shooter, Salvador Ramos, was killed amid the shooting on Tuesday. Outrage has erupted online and on cable news after it was revealed that local police went inside the building minutes after the gunman entered unchallenged, but quickly retreated and took cover. Ramos was killed by a Border Patrol agents more than an hour later. Texas Department of Public Safety TDPS Lieutenant Chris Olivares told CNN that police did not engage with Ramos further due to concerns that they would have taken fire and officers could have been shot. The words the word cowards turned it on Twitter in reference to the police after news of the delay emerged. Okay, there's a little more of this. I'm going to get to it. I want to bring Joe back here because this is something that I talked about on the show yesterday. Joe, with Stephen Semler. He's the co-founder of Security Policy Reform Institute. And the point that I was making, and I tell people I like to bring up kind of tangents and angles and points that you're not hearing in a lot of other places. And the point that I was bringing up is that if we are thinking that a solution or that a mitigation or that really any help with this horrible circumstance existing in America is going to come from better training of police, by criticizing police, by calling them out as cowards, it's not going to happen, because the way that I explained it to people, and it's kind of odd to me with all of these guns across America and so many people exposed to them, there ain't many people in this real world that we live in. Now, I'm not talking about Hollywood. I'm talking about the real world. There ain't many that are going to run toward gunfire, run into an AR-15. Cops ain't going to do it. Soldiers don't do it. I mean, it's just not, it's not realistic for us to expect this to be any part of the solution. I think it's magic thinking, and I think it's actually part of the problem. And I'm very interested to hear your take on that.
Well, I have a background in law enforcement, and I've taught in the area of law enforcement. And, you know, I think it's normal for people to be really frustrated by the type of response that happened in Uvalde. And it's not the first time we've seen this. It was similar in Columbine and Parkland. And, you know, after Columbine, there was kind of a real debate within law enforcement about tactics for responding to Rampage killings, and the tactics that had been in place to set up and control the perimeter and get as many potential victims out as possible. And these are all time-consuming moments. At the same time, a Rampage killer is running around on scene with semi-automatic assault weapons. And that changed to a first shooter response where, you go in, you hit the scene, you look for the shooter, you take them out. But even after that, we're not seeing those tactics deployed in Parkland or here. So, and I don't know, George, I might disagree slightly with you. I know it's hard to run into the line of fire or something, but, when it comes to policing, that, as they say, that's why you buy that dog, right?
Yeah. They're paid to do that. I mean, they take an oath.
And they have a lot of protective gear, and they've got their own firearms. And I sympathize with it. And I will say something about police in America today. Last year in 2021, more police officers were shot to death than at any time in this country's history. And if anyone should be lining up on behalf of trying to reduce gun violence, it should be our law enforcement community. And the law enforcement executives are doing that. It's the rank and file law enforcement agents who are being slow to come around.
Okay, with your background in military policing, let me ask you this, because again, this was brought up by Steven Semler. The show yesterday was excellent. I'd encourage people to check that out. He made a point that I hadn't really thought about, and this has maybe changed even since you were active in law enforcement, Joe. But what he's saying is that it's become increasingly militaristic, both in equipment and in the people that we hire, the men and women that become police officers in our communities. And what he's saying is, in the military, your first inclination, your reflex isn't to protect others and civilians in a theater of war, as an example. It's to protect yourself. It's to protect your unit. It's to protect the soldiers next to you so that you can carry on the fight, more or less. Well, that is kind of contrary to the circumstance that we saw in Uvalde and in these situations. I don't know. Do you think there's something to that?
Well, this as they call this militarization of law enforcement, has actually had some real benefits to it. Law enforcement doesn't spend much time responding to rampage killings. Most of their time when these tactics are deployed is when they're serving warrants on violent offenders or on a stash house or something like that. And one of the things we have found is that fewer officers are being shot or injured during those type of tactical engagements than previously. So to some extent, this militarization of law enforcement has a real benefit because, as you say, it helps the police to protect one another. The problem is it's like a lot of military tactics, right? They can't be deployed uniformly across all tactical environments. And so rampage killings, yeah, you have to be well prepared to go in and take out the shooter and try to protect as many lives as you can. But it has to be a rapid response. I mean, it's going down fast. But I'm not an expert in this area, so I want to be a little bit careful about criticizing the police. I think it's something that law enforcement, the leadership and the community of law enforcement agents in our country have to take a closer look at and be better trained in, probably.
Well, here's somebody that you won't be reluctant to criticize, and I'm not either. And I have Dr. Stephen W. Schmidt from Iowa State University on the podcast all the time. And he's the first one to point out, and man, I agree. And I don't think this can be overstated. I mean, what runs the world, what runs this country in particular, is politics. So let's bring up this next slide here, and I want to talk about what we're seeing here. This is out of the New York Times. It was the wrong decision, police say, of the delay in confronting the gunman. Now, this is, again, some of this reporting about what went on in Uvalde and criticizing the police. Officials described a harrowing series of 9/11 calls, including some from children inside Robb Elementary in Uvalde. The National Rifle Association's annual convention opened in Houston, and former President Donald J. Trump defended gun owners. Okay, we got a lot of these slides to work to, but Joe, I wanted to ask you this in particular. I mean, you know this probably all too well. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, again, it's ingrained in the American psyche, and yeah, they're having an annual convention down there, and Trump is going to talk about it. Well, what the hell are they doing? Really? Why does the NRA, what do they do at a national convention? What's the point of that? And of course, they can be roundly criticized, I would think, for doing that there right now. But just in general, what are they up to?
Well, first of all, let me just point out that the one place that the National Rifle Association does not support open carry or concealed carry is inside their convention hall. So if you're a member of the NRA and you attend that meeting, you leave your guns outside. You leave your guns in the car or at home. Because they understand that, when you get a lot of people closed up together in a room like that, a lot of emotions going on, something very bad can happen. And so there's the rank hypocrisy just of this. As an organization, I mean, they are not only a financially bankrupt organization, which they are because they've been caught in so many irregularities and shenanigans with their funds. And I believe they've actually declared bankruptcy. But they're a morally bankrupt organization as well. They are pimped out by the gun industry and in service of America's gun militants. And they are a major part of the problem. But, when something like this happens, they actually see this as an opportunity to consolidate their base. their base of gun militants. Most members of the NRA, or the majority of members of NRA, don't just own one rifle for hunting or their sport shooting. They're what we call arsenalists. They have 10 or more weapons. Okay. There's a really small percentage of Americans and a relatively small percentage of gun owners who are militants. They're part of the crowd that attacked the state capitol. They're part of the QAnon crowd, and they're a dangerous presence in America.
All right, let me continue with this. I want to bring this up on screen here with this article because, okay, so I'm going to preface this a little bit. I know Joe catches my podcast when he can with Laura Bellin, and I talked about Stephen W. Schmidt. We talk about it, and Laura and I talk about it all the time when it comes to politics. And the point that I make, I recite this line out of the movie Casino, which is, for whatever reason, it's on satellite television right now. I said Casino's getting a replay everywhere, but in that movie, Robert De Niro catches his slot manager after the slot machines have been grand jackpots have been hit 2 or 3 times in a row. And he tells that guy, he says, "Do you know what the odds of that are?" And the guy says something like, "Well, it's a casino. People got to win sometime." And he says, "Now you're insulting my intelligence. I mean, and the point of this is you're fired. And the reason that you're fired is you're either too dumb. I mean, if you really think that that could happen, you're too dumb, or you're in on it. Those are the only 2 choices." And I see this in politics all the time. And it gets to this article that I'm going to bring here through NPR. Texas Governor Greg Abbott says he was misled about the Uvalde shooting police response. And Texas Governor Greg Abbott said during a press conference in Uvalde that he was misled about the police response to the shooting at the Robb Elementary School. He said the information that he provided at a press conference 2 days ago was a recitation of what law enforcement had told him in a room beforehand. He said he's livid that some of that information has turned out to be wrong, and he expects law enforcement to thoroughly investigate what happened. All right, so let me bring that down and because this is, are they too dumb or are they in on it? Because you look at that and you say, well, hell, nobody knew. Nobody suspected that law enforcement recitation was wrong. Yeah, they did. It was all over the place, from the major networks to, the smallest podcast by George podcaster. Everybody was saying, this doesn't pass the smell test. I mean, they're lying. They're obfuscating. They're hiding. They're dodging. They're bobbing. They're weaving. But Abbott wants us to believe that he didn't know, that he didn't understand that. And it takes me all the way back to the decision by the United States to go into Iraq. I mean, a lot of people still want to give W a pass on that, Joe, and say, well, nobody knew. Hell, I knew. I was on a street corner with a sign that said, listen to the UN. War is not the answer. Do not go into Iraq. My wife was doing that too. There were people that knew that were smart enough to see through that, even though the casino slot manager apparently can't. That's the way that Abbott strikes me. What's your perspective on that guy down there, Joe? I know this isn't your first time in having to deal with Abbott from Texas.
I used to brief generals when I was in the military on criminal investigations, and I find it hard to believe that someone is going to walk into the governor's office and outright lie to them about the time frame. I just don't buy it. I think Abbott knew the truth, and he's outright lying because he is facing a very potent political opponent in Beto. And gun violence is one of Beto's key areas. I mean, there was a rampage killing and a massacre of his constituents in El Paso 2 years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was. And so he's not going to go in and take any responsibility for this. And, this is the party that always talks about individual responsibility, right? If you want to get ahead in life, you have to take responsibility for your decisions, good, bad, or whatever. But Beto and Reynolds, not Beto, excuse me, Abbott and Reynolds and people of their ilk, they just want to make sure they don't get on the bad side of the gun militants. That's it. I mean, it's as simple as it's just so simple. It's not rocket science.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. I have the rest of this article up by NPR, but my God, it's so difficult to read. I makes an old man weepy, folks. I apologize for that. Students make several 911 calls to police. By 12:15 p.m., a Border Patrol tactical team was on the scene, still under the command from the school district police chief. No one was allowed entry inside. This is despite the fact several 911 calls were made throughout the ordeal by children and others inside the classroom, explaining that kids were hurt or dead and that the shooter was still inside. Intermittent shooting continued during the ordeal, which officers did hear, McGraw said. At one point, Ramos reportedly shot at the classroom door towards police, forcing them to move further down the hallway. One 911 recording showed that a child in one of the locked classrooms was on the phone with 911 for an extended period and requested police to be sent in, saying 8 or 9 kids were still alive, McGraw explained. At 12:50 p.m., more than an hour after the ordeal began, officers obtained keys from a janitor, entered the room, and shot the suspect, he said. Now, here's something that Joe can comment on. This is his life's work. There were 142 spent rounds found inside the school, McGraw said, along with 173 live rounds. The gunman had a total of 60 magazines with him, he said, including 31 magazines that were in a backpack that he did not take with him inside the school. Now, Joe, I don't know anything. I know that there's a call to limit the purchasing of these magazines, particularly elongated magazines. But is it legal? I know he legally purchased this gun when he turned 18, I believe. Is it legal to purchase that many magazines?
Oh, yeah. And it's legal in Iowa, and it's legal in Texas, and it's legal in every state except for those that do not ban assault rifles. And I just want to say something here. This is probably the good moment to say this. When someone is shot with an assault rifle, the reason why it's such a devastating injury is because it's an extremely high velocity round. It travels at excess of 2,000 feet per second. So if someone shoots me, let's say in the lower back with an AR-15, when that bullet comes in, it creates a concave cavity effect, a cavity effect. It has these sonic sound waves that are blasting up behind it, destroying everything in its path, obliterating everything in its path. By contrast, if I'm shot with a 9mm pistol, it's just going to go through and through. So what this means is a person, and especially small children, of course, a person can be shot in the thigh and it hits the bone. It doesn't hit the artery, but it explodes that bone and cuts the femoral artery, and they bleed out on the spot. So this is why assault weapons are assault weapons. This is why they're weapons for the battlefield.
Yes.
They're extremely deadly. They're extremely deadly. They're easy to maneuver. Okay. They're very easy to handle. The ejection systems are nowadays such that they don't jam very much, like the M16s I had. Yeah. These don't jam up. But in any event, yeah, you're right. I could go down to Shields right now and buy just as many extended magazines and cartridges as I want. There's no law preventing that at all.
I saw an article one time talking about assault weapons in America in Rolling Stone magazine, actually. And I don't even know who the author was, who he was interviewing, but he said, along the lines that you're talking about, it's not like getting shot with a bullet. I mean, these are weapons of war. What they want is for one bullet to kill. And he said it's like being shot with a bullet the size of a spinning pop can. He said that's the effect that it has. So one bullet can literally rip a human being in half. And this is the type of weapon and the type of ammunition that's being purchased at your local sporting goods store. Okay. I'm not a weapons guy. I don't like even talking about this stuff, but I mean, again, we got to look at this. We got to understand it. Okay. So I wanted to bring this up on screen, Joe, because this goes to the heart of what you've been talking about. And there's going to be a call for inaction on this. Now, Joe's calling for action and has been, but there's going to be, we can't do anything about this. Look at this. Kim Reynolds, this is out of today's paper. The governor of the state of Iowa advocates for more school security, not more gun control. And I don't want to bring up the entire article here because I want Joe to talk about this, but what they're saying here, this is this throwing dust up in the air. This is this obfuscation. This is this, Joe said it's not rocket science. This is trying to make it into rocket science, to make people believe that we're helpless, that nothing can be done, and that the solution is not any type of gun control whatsoever.
Right. And so what she's engaging in is just NRA talking points. And the premise of those points is always that, well, we can't stop gun violence. Well, no one on my side of the issue, not Brady, not Moms Demand Action, no one on my side of the on our side of this debate has ever suggested we're going to just stop all gun violence. And so what her lie was about was, well, we can't ban assault weapons because it's not a panacea. Well, it's not a panacea. I mean, it's no one's suggesting it'll stop all these kind of shootings. What it will do is it will reduce the risk factors. It will mean that people who are sending their children to schools throughout America will be less likely to be shot to death by these weapons. And that's a big deal. And we know when we had an assault weapons ban in this country during the 90s, that it worked to reduce gun violence. I mean, the evidence is extremely clear. Did it stop gun violence? No. But it dramatically helped reduce gun violence. And so what she is doing is just, what her handlers are telling her to do in accordance with what the gun militant population and the NRA want her to say. And that's all it is. And it's disgusting because that type of rhetoric is going to help ensure that more of these little children and adults, by the way, of course, law enforcement agents are going to be shot to death with these weapons. And it's not just bans on assault weapons that we need, but there are other things we can do. All right. These early risk protection orders that some people call red flag laws that are embedded with all kinds of due process protections would help. The 2 police officers who were assassinated in West Des Moines and Urbandale 3 years ago were shot to death by a maniac who a couple of days before that was in court dealing with a restraining order filed by his mother, okay, to keep him out of her house. Now, during that time, the judge probably didn't say, well, does he have any firearms? Because it wouldn't have made any difference. There wasn't a red flag order that would have compelled police officers to take those firearms away and have a court hearing to determine if he was safe to have them. If that had been present, those police officers might not have been assassinated. And so there are so many things that we can do that are simple. Red flag laws, early risk protection orders, obviously universal background checks. It should not be possible in this country to buy a handgun. And we won't even get into how advanced handguns have become, but to buy a handgun or an assault rifle without a thorough background check, I mean, it's insanity. Yeah, and she knows it. That's the thing. Reynolds knows this. She's not stupid. She's smart. And so she's playing to that base, her gun militant base. Yeah, and it's disgusting.
Well, to go back to my original analogy with Abbott and Reynolds, these people, what Joe's telling you is they're not dumb. No. They're in on it. I mean, that's what he's saying. Let me bring this up because we're at a juncture where people, oh my God, what are we going to do? We've got these people like Abbott and Reynolds, and we just can't undo this. Okay, let me bring up, this is from the Brady United website. These are 5 kind of action items, things that we can act now upon. As a society, we failed the 19 children and 2 teachers from Uvalde. Now we must honor them by turning our grief into action. And it says, are you with us? Now, I want to bring this photo up because these kids are still alive. So I love to look at these photos of the kids, the beautiful children. It says, together we can move the needles to save lives and prevent tragedies. Here's how you can take action now. Let's bring these items up. Here's the girls again. Now we're going to, again, I want to take a spin through this National Gun Violence Memorial, hopefully, before we wrap up. I just can't show that enough. Okay. So demand Congress to pass stronger gun laws. We must demand the U.S. Senate bring background checks, as Joe was just talking about, even if that means eliminating the filibuster. Okay, Joe, this is something this maybe is the most important thing that I wanted you to talk about because, I hear these calls all the time. Let's get these politicians to do something. Yeah, great idea. My wife mails letters. My wife calls these people. She goes to their town halls, and I have too. And I'm beginning to sign petitions. I used to sign petitions. I don't even do that anymore. And when it comes to people like we're talking about here, these politicians on this show, I don't think it does any good. I want you to counter that argument. Tell me that we can make these people do anything.
And I've been in the political field too. I've managed political campaigns. I had a political consulting firm years ago down in Houston. And I firmly believe that the name of the game in politics is you have to put unrelenting pressure on elected officials. And if you don't, their only goal is going to be to get reelected. Okay. And if they can, whatever path of least resistance to getting reelected that they can find, that's the path they're going to take. Now, the problem with gun violence is this: America, as a populace, has not really stood up and made the demands. Some have, okay? Some have, but most really haven't. I mean, I cannot tell you how difficult it is during when the legislature's in session in Iowa, and I'm not a spokesperson for moms, but I know moms is in that legislative session every single year, and I've been down there for the last 3 or 4 years. And it is almost impossible to mobilize people to get into to fill up that Capitol. Okay. And, it's just so very difficult. And the reason why is because, movements are based on what affects me, right? The labor movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement during the Vietnam period, the civil rights movement. All right. And as much gun violence as there is in this country, it doesn't affect most people. Now, also, I would say along that line, that most gun homicides and gun violence is perpetrated against people of color. And as a movement, our movement has done a very bad job of pulling in people of color into the movement. The gun violence movement is largely a white middle class movement. And that might not be true as much on the two coasts and in some of the major metropolitan areas, but we have really not done what we need to do. And this is what I'm trying to do right now in Waterloo, is to sort of mobilize that and then hopefully broaden that out into the state. But I just feel like, and I'm pessimistic too, George, especially, after what happened at Sandy Hook. I thought Sandy Hook was a turning point. And I've been very disappointed by President Obama. I thought President Obama would come out of the White House and make this as like Habitat for Humanity, as President Carter did. And he helped, focus the nation on the tragedy and the massacre at Sandy Hook. But then he came out and he's been completely silent. And so we need more people to help us mobilize on this. And we need people to be responsive. And frankly, I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's hard for me to understand. It's the most frustrating thing of what I'm doing right now, because I try to emphasize to people how many children are being killed. Take, for instance, Uvalde. And let me just say something. When those children were killed in there, that was the most nightmarish, horrific, unbelievably god-awful way to end their lives, their precious lives. Those guns were blasting. The gunpowder was out there, the blood and the bones, everybody, and the little children. It was the worst thing you can ever imagine. And it happens in families too. It happens in families. Those children massacred in Uvalde amount to 6% of the children between the ages of 0 and 12 who will be killed this year in America, between the ages of infant and 12. Let me just say that again. This year, as last year and the year before, more than 300 children between the ages of infant and 12 will be shot to death. And many more will be grievously injured, lose limbs, suffer paralysis, okay? And their families will live a lifetime of trauma from which they can never escape, and heartache from which they will never be shed of, ever. And this is all in service of gun militants and their delusional ideas about the Second Amendment.
Well, we've lost our minds. Well, and this is a hot button issue. I had a show on Roe recently, and it was the same kind of way. So we're getting a lot of comments and questions from viewers. I want to bring this up because I want to encourage people to do this. I want them to get their questions in here and get them asked of people like Joe here. This is from John. He says, somehow a 10-year assault weapons ban did pass Congress in 1994, Joe. How did that happen? What's the difference between then and now? I can remember 1994 pretty well. I know you can too. how has America changed since then?
Well, in 1994, we had a Democratic president, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House. And so there was a more rational debate about guns and gun violence. All right. And part of this also, I'll say, is that organizations like Brady, that is across the ideological spectrum, were able to help, mobilize conservative Democrats to get on board with this. But since then, we've Republicans have taken a virtual control over federal government, and certainly in our state government. And so Republicans came into power under Bush the first. They repealed that law, and then and it's never been brought back. And then Republicans and conservatives mounted a very successful campaign to get a law passed in a Supreme Court decision, Heller v. D.C., that that was also very supportive of the Second Amendment. So this really gets down, as we've talked about before, George, and as you know all too well, this is really all about politics.
Yeah,
and
everything is. And we're already well over half gone here on the show. I like to hold these live streams to about an hour or so. Joe and I could probably talk all day about this. But one thing I get accused of, and it's kind of all podcasters do, all pontificators do, a lot of criticism, a lot of bitching, a lot of pissing, a lot of moaning. But I often, what do we do? What can we do? Well, that's why I want to keep moving through these slides that we have here, Joe, of things that can and should be done. And this is more significant than some people may think. I don't think I even got the significance of it, but it says urge senators to confirm Biden's nominee to lead the ATF at a time when gun violence is surging. We cannot allow the federal agency that oversees the gun industry to continue to lack leadership. Okay, so let me. I had this up yesterday. This slide. Again, I don't want this to be all political, but I mean, sometimes people deserve criticism. And here's Grassley. And I look at this, and you talk about bad optics, folks. You hear that term? This is bad optics. This photo is bad optics. For one thing, look at that guy. Now, I'm an old boy. I'm getting older. And I don't want to be accused of being an ageist, but Grassley has been in the U.S. Senate for nigh on 50 years, screwing everything up to the point that we're about to perish on this planet, I think, from the big three, which I talk about on my show all the time, Joe: climate, war, and healthcare. And in that order. Well, here is Chuck Grassley reiterating concerns over gun control as the Senate considers this ATF confirmation. This was out of the Register. And Brienne wrote this. So it says, amid new calls for gun control measures, U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley reiterated concerns that President Joe Biden's nominee to lead the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearm, and Explosives is not sufficiently supportive of the Second Amendment. My God, I think this should have been a lead story on nightly news. I mean, really, because I looked at this and I thought, my God, what have they done? Have they, dug up a quote from a couple of weeks ago, maybe when this was being considered, and they're trying to make Grassley look bad? Listen to this. Grassley, who is the top Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, made the comments during confirmation hearings for Stephen Dettelbach Wednesday, the day after a teenage shooter gunned down at least 19 children and 2 adults at an Uvalde, Texas elementary school. Well, how in the hell are you that dumb, or are you that much in on it that you make that kind of a comment? But, and again, it has to do with Grassley, who he is, what he's done, maybe even how old he is. Again, call me an ageist if you want to. What in the hell, Joe? So maybe you can comment on Grassley if you want to, but talk about this ATF confirmation and why this is so significant to Brady United.
Well, let me set the table on it this way and talk about the politics here. So in most state elections, even such as Iowa, which were, I wouldn't say we're a purple state, we're a red state with a tinge of blue in it. But the Republican Party doesn't have a lockdown majority of votes really in most parts of the United States. So what they have, though, let's give the Republican Party 40% of the vote. All right. Now, 20% of that 40% are really extremist, at least that many. Some polls show at least half. Okay. And so people like Grassley know that if they don't throw red meat to those extremists, the Republican Party and him along with it go down in elections. All right. And so they've got to do that. They're afraid those folks will go off and just go fishing on election day or form another kind of extreme party or something like that. So they're constantly speaking to and trying to mollify this extremist wing of their own party, because without that, they don't have a majority and they know it. Now, the ATF, going back to the kind of emergence of right-wing extremism in the United States with groups like Posse Comitatus and these others, these radical kind of so-called constitutionalists that started popping up and talking about, all kinds of extreme ideas in the 90s. They've always held the ATF out as one of their main enemies. And the reason why is because they love their guns. And they believe, they have a delusional idea in their mind that someday the United States is going to act the government is going to act in a tyrannical fashion. Yeah. And they will stand there with their AR-15s and they'll stop the F-8 Hornets and the tanks and everything else. But they're delusional. I mean, they really are psychotic. All right. They're delusional. But that part of that party has their has really sort of de facto control over republicanism today. Now, the ATF is really important. And by the way, anytime they want to oppose a gun law, they talk about the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment. Well, here's one of the big functions of the ATF, and that's to close that iron pipeline of guns moving from low gun regulation states to high regulation states. A lot of the guns that are used in gun violence in Iowa's urban areas are brought up here from other states. Okay, that's a federal crime, and the FBI doesn't really get after it. The DEA, that's the ATF, and we need the ATF. But when the ATF starts going after those crimes, you know who they start going after? They start going after the businesses that are selling those guns. All right, and so let's get right down to it. This isn't just about politics. This is about money. All right. And so the fringe element is making a lot of money off of guns. All right. Blood money. And Grassley and his fellow Republicans who have knelt at the altar of extremism are trying to help them protect their money. And that's just really, that's what it is. And that'll help them protect their symbol of delusional ideas, which is a gun.
Well, I'm a real lefty, Joe. I mean, I'm left of the Democratic Party. I may be left of you. I talk to people across the political spectrum. And recent polling has shown this. You don't talk to people and they say, man, we're really going good. I mean, America is great. I mean, wave the flag. I mean, I just really like the way that things are now. And I tell people, if for no other reason, I mean, you know how we got here. We got here because of people like Grassley. That's a reason enough not to vote someone in who you know is going to continue the programs and policies and perspective that you so dislike right now, that is putting you into the street, that's making you crawl through the windows of the Capitol, for God's sake. You're going to vote for that guy again? What the hell for? He's been there 47 years. It's his fault. Vote these people out. Well, okay. I don't want to, this is not my political podcast. We'll get to that again. So I want to continue with this. These things are important, and this is a big deal with Brady United. And you've got a video out about this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to show it, but ask your friends and family, do you lock up your guns? Okay, now this is important to me, but again, I got a slightly different angle or twist on this, Joe. My feeling is, and I said this on the show yesterday, we're not going to round up guns. You're not going to go get them.
That's right.
You're not going to go door to door and get people to give them to you, to buy them back or whatever. The point is, those people got those guns. They bought those. They're practicing with those guns so that you can't take them away from them. You're never going to get these guns away from people. There are 300 million of them. Plus, Joe would know the figure in America. A goodly portion of those are these killer, deadly assault rifles. They can kill everybody on your block in about 30 seconds flat, folks. You ain't going to go get those guns. You're not going to put them into a smelter. That's not what's going to happen. And talking about that type of stuff is not only not effective, it's counterproductive. It's kind of the same way with Republicans to a certain extent, but that's a political discussion. I mean, unless you're going to run them off the edge of the earth, sitting on cable TV every night bitching about Republicans to Democrats, it doesn't have much value. Well, when it comes to guns that are already out there, that are never going away, there are guns that, in my town from the Civil War, I tell people, this may be the best case scenario. This may be as good as we can do. Get people to lock the damn things up again to protect the kids, Joe.
Well, securing those weapons in one's homes is critically important. I mean, it's in so many ways. The problem is that too many people, when they buy a gun, they buy it with the delusion that they're going to be able to use it to defend themselves in an attack. And that is very, very rarely the case. All right. But for that reason, they don't lock them up. All right. I can show you so many instances of children and women who have been killed by someone who bought a gun for self-defense, and then use that gun to kill their children or to kill their spouse and themselves. So it makes common sense. I mean, when police officers go home, they lock their guns up. All right. But there are just too many, and it's a very tough law to enforce. I will add. Okay. It's not an easy law to enforce. And it's something we can do, but there are other really important things we can do as well. I mean, universal background checks, I cannot overemphasize that. All right.
We're going to get to those.
That's really a big one.
Let me see if they're, because there's 5 of these things. Are the universal background checks one of these slides here that I'm looking at?
It should be there.
I don't know.
I think it might have been up higher. It might have been on the first one. I'm not sure.
Well, it would be stronger gun laws. Obviously, it would be right. A part of that. And what's the kick? What's the objection to universal background checks? I know people are very privacy minded right now, and they don't want their business looked into, but we're not talking about going into your personal computer or something like that. These universal background checks are pretty basic stuff, right?
Yeah, there's no rational objection, right? And right now, the only background checks that are enforced in Iowa and in most states is when you buy from a licensed gun dealer, a federally licensed gun dealer. Now, here's what the law says: that if I sell you a Glock, 9mm Glock, I have to ask you, well, have you had your background check? And when you say, I'm supposed to ask you, but I probably won't. And then you're supposed to say yes, and you could lie. All right. What mandatory gun background checks would be, well, I can't transfer this gun to you until you show me proof of your background check. Okay. Mandatory universal background checks, whether it's at a gun show or wherever. Okay. And what this does is it just makes it so much easier for people to transfer dangerous firearms into the hands of dangerous people. And there's no rational reason to, oppose it.
I would imagine a lot of people favor it right now, but again, and you've seen this so many times, Uvalde's going to slip away from the national consciences. And by the way, these school killings and these multiple shootings, they continue, folks. I mean, it's just not hitting the top pages of your newspaper. And as these things fade into the background, then this rationale, this logic for universal background checks that Joe's talking about tends to get lost. Well, I want to continue here because we're running out of time. I mentioned that the big part of the podcast, this show anyway, is things that could and should be done. Talk about this one, Joe. Join the grassroots movement.
Well, that's the big one. I wish everyone would do it. I hope that everyone who sees this broadcast will send an email to Iowa@BradyUnited.org And or you can send an email to me, gorton44@gmail.com, gorton44@gmail.com, because we really don't have that grassroots movement. When the Me Too movement started, it started for really important reasons. I mean, for women and others, men too, to stand up and rally on a national level against sexual assault of women. All right. And wow, has it had a big effect? All right. It's been massive, and it's been a big benefit throughout our culture. That hasn't happened with the gun violence movement. It really hasn't. I mean, we see what happened yesterday in Texas with the protests. But I always say to my students, I think we have a rampage killing syndrome, where when these killings take place, when these massacres happen, depending on the number and the social status of the victims, we'll get a real peak in interest. And then after a few days, the media will stop paying attention, and it'll soften out. What happens during that trough of interest is another maniac is fantasizing about committing another rampage killing, as this young man was. Okay, he planned this out. People they fantasize about this, and then they hit some kind of precipitating moment, some kind of moment of desperation. Sometimes we don't know what it is because they take their own lives, and they act out. So this is going to happen again, and it's going to keep happening until we have a true grassroots movement that is cohesive and determined and doesn't really feel the need to be polite about telling politicians what they should be doing.
All right, good. And as is always the case as we go through these live streams, the streams sometimes deteriorate. We had a little freeze there. I hope we can continue going, because I want to show some of the National Gun Violence Memorial webpage and have Joe talk through that when we end the show here. But here's the last one, Joe. Donate to bolster our work to prevent gun violence. And I would look at this and say, okay, they're just begging for money. But the point of this is your opponents, the people and people watching this think, oh, hey, who the hell would oppose this? Yeah, well, there's a lot of people that oppose this, and boy, they got big bucks. I mean, to be able to be successful, and you have had some success, but it does take money.
The contingent, the force of gun militancy is well funded in this country. They are well organized, and they are determined. They have ideologies that bring them together and give them a sense of identity and aggrievement and persecution. Meanwhile, on our side, it's just really hard to get people involved in something that they rightfully perceive as probably not going to affect them personally in their lives. But, the very least that you can do is give money to organizations like Brady. It's very expensive what we do. One of the reasons why we're succeeding in some states is because we're able to do two things. We're able to file lawsuits against these gun manufacturers, these fly-by-night gun manufacturers, and we're able to lobby in legislatures and in Congress. And that takes a lot of work. Lawyers are expensive. Lobbyists are expensive. And we need help. And again, politicians aren't going to do this thing because it's the right thing to do. They're going to follow the path of least resistance to their reelection. That's it. And if you believe anything different than that, then you're not paying attention to American politics. And so what we have to do is make inaction no longer a path of least resistance. And we can't do that without the help of Americans who deeply care about this kind of violence. That's, there's no way around it. We just have to get involved, or the problem will continue. And that is why it continues, is because not enough Americans show their concern with their activism or with their pocketbook.
Well, that's well said. And if you need any additional motivation, let me bring this up on screen, Joe, if you can see this and talk us through what we're seeing here. This is the website, the National Gun Violence Memorial.
So if you you can just Google National Gun Violence Memorial, and the first thing that will pop up are photographs of everyone who's been shot to death in this country. Almost everyone. There's some pictures that don't make it in, but then you can also hit the click button, and it'll come up on this page, which are children between the ages of infant and 12. You can also click on law enforcement officers who have been shot to death. So these first, if you can scroll down a little bit, George. So these first three rows are up to, I think, where we have Xavier Lopez, who was at Uvalde. So those are all his name. Those are all above. Those are Uvalde. But look at these children and look at these little infants. Just keep scrolling down. Look at these little babies and these little, shot to death. And many of these are shot to death. The last thing they see in their life is their sibling or their mommy being shot to death, or their mommy sees them being shot to death. It is the most horrific. You can't write a horror movie script that is worse than what these little sweethearts experienced in their life. And as America, we're doing nothing about it. The media doesn't talk about this. So when we have something like Uvalde, but you know what? Guess what? Uvalde will, the number of children killed at Uvalde will happen 15 times a year.
Wow.
And younger, children younger. Sandy Hook happens 15 times a year. Okay. But like I say, it happens over in Tulsa, or it happens in, Biloxi, or it happens in, Richmond, Virginia. And when you read the news reports in these little, in these pockets of horror, the community is just devastated. They're just devastated for a few days, and it goes away. Right here in Iowa, there was a family annihilation murder in Des Moines 2 years ago, where a man who I believe he worked for the DPS. I think he was a civilian employee of the DPS, a staffer, and he shot his wife and 2 children to death, and then took his own life. And he probably purchased his gun for self-defense, and something happened in his life. And this is the other problem: is people, when they purchase guns, can be perfectly sane, can be perfectly mentally healthy, and then they go along in life and something happens, and they snap. And when that snap happens, it doesn't happen overnight. So that woman was, my guess is, and this is not just a guess, I know I've written and published about domestic violence. That woman who was shot to death and her children probably saw her husband unraveling and knew he had a gun and was afraid. But she had nowhere to go. She couldn't call the police, because if she did, they say, well, we can't do anything about it. He has a gun. But if we have emergency risk protection orders, that gun could have been removed from the house. Okay. The same as with the person who assassinated the 2 police officers in Des Moines. So we have to give police officers the tools they need to try to, it won't stop all of them, but to try to reduce the risk of these kind of family annihilation murders and domestic violence homicides. In 2020 and 2021, 17 women were shot to death in intimate partner violence in Iowa. And those women didn't have any, if they knew there was a gun in the house and they were at risk, maybe they could get out. That's hard, but there was no way they could call the police to say, come get this gun and let's have a hearing on this. And let's let a judge hear, and let's let the gun owner and others talk about this, and let people come to a rational decision if this is a person who's safe with a firearm. And but we don't have that. Some states have it, but we don't.
And if you don't care about the women, if you don't care about the cops, if you don't care about the kids, do it for yourself. When I look at that scroll of those children, Joe, that are gone, what I think, whenever I see kids that perish like that from climate war and healthcare, I think to myself, that could be the kid that ends war. That could be the kid that solves the climate catastrophe.
Oh my God.
That could be the kid that solves the healthcare crisis in America, but not any longer, because they perished that way. Well, we're out of time. I want to end this show. I'm going to play a video, Joe, and I invite you to watch it here at the end. It's only about a minute or so long, but it's an interview that I did when I first started Podcast by George in the first year. It was with Becca Schneid. Becca is a survivor of the Parkland school shooting. She was witness to that horrific circumstance down there. She survived, but she's been forever affected by it. And that's what she's talking about in this video that I'm going to play. She authored a poem called Zoo Animal, and I'm going to play that to close the show instead of me doing my usual thing. But I want to give you the last word here before we do that, Joe. I want to give you an opportunity to wrap this up, put a bow on this particular edition of Podcast by George.
George, I'll say 2 things. I always like to give a shout out to anybody who would like to have a debate with me about this matter. But, this gun militant crowd, they're too cowardly to take me up on it. But if anybody ever wants to contact me and set up a moment to have a debate about this, I'd be happy to do that, so that people can make their own decisions about your delusional ideas. The other thing I want to do, George, is just thank you for discussing this. I do believe one of the failures that we've had is the media not really digging deeper into the weeds about gun violence. And so I appreciate you taking the time, making the effort to do just that. It's very important. If we can shine a more consistent light on the problem, I believe Americans will solve the problem. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the the encouraging words there at the end. Thanks, Joe Gorton. Now that's Joe with the Brady United of Iowa, the Iowa branch of Brady United, on Podcast by George. I've been putting the organization's URLs and website addresses across the screen here as we did this show, but you can find them. Just Google Brady United and Iowa, or whatever state you're from, and they'll put you in contact with a proper person. Joe, thanks again for coming on the Podcast by George live line.
Thank you, sir.
And folks, if you like this particular episode, if you like Podcast by George, even if you disagree, that's all right. But you can get all of the episodes online. You can see them in video on Facebook and on YouTube. You can see all the past shows there in video. And also, the easiest way to get us really is to go to podcastbygeorge.com, and then you can just choose which platform. You can get audio for your car or for your phone if that's the way that you like to listen. And again, you can follow us and subscribe on Facebook and YouTube. Well, as promised, I'm going to wrap up here. I'm going to end. I'm going to play this video at the end here. Now, this is when I was still doing just audio-only versions of Podcasts by George. So we're just going to have a graphic up of Becca Schneid, beautiful young woman. She's a college student now. She was 17 years old when she did this, and she was reading from a book that she's authored, or that she was a part of one of the authors in it, and a poem that she wrote entitled Zoo Animal. And we're going to take it out. That's going to be the ending. That's going to be all there is, and there ain't no more of this particular episode of Podcast by George. Here's Becca.
My name is Charles Way. I'm Tom.
Oh, wrong video. Here is Becca.
Some people tell us to wait. We must be patient. We cannot exploit the deaths of our classmates. Well, that frustrates me. People die every day. You remain blind and think that this country can be great without legislation that attempts to eliminate the hate. Because the revolution is not waiting, the revolution is not coming, the revolution is now, it is angry, it is hungry, and it is a force to be reckoned with. I realize that I don't just feel like a zoo animal, I am a zoo animal. I have been a zoo animal. These bars have been around me for so long that I'm conditioned to think that it is normal. It is not. So while we may not be immortal, this passion, this fervor, this persistence for resistance is. We will not rest until these bars are broken, until we are zoo animals no more, but instead free of the shackles we once bore.
You read that flawlessly.